we got to watch a lot of Arne yesterday with his Orzhov Horus deck, just putting up very impressive results.
Well, I gotta say, it's a great reminder about why we do this. We were just talking with our boss Greg about this, and you know what Arne said is what captured all of us about the competitive side of Magic. You know, Magic has a lot of different angles to it. You can enjoy this game many different ways. What you and I like is this. We like the highest level of competition. This is what draws us to this game, and it drew Arne in as well. And hearing him talk about that was just it was refreshing and inspirational. Let's see if he can keep his streak going here. Look, when you bring Dimir Rogues to the battlefield, you're kind of hoping to find Sultai Ultimatum over there a decent percentage of the time, which is exactly what happened to Arne in this tournament.
Yeah, and an ideal start here from Arne with the turn 1 Thieves Guild Enforcer into a turn 2 Soaring Thought Thief. However, Grzegorz also has a very solid draw here. He's got the Heartless Act here for potentially the Soaring Thought Thief. He could also choose to get the Thieves Guild Enforcer because he also has one of, I believe, the best cards in this matchup specifically, and that's Elspeth's Nightmare. Elspeth's Nightmare will almost always get you 2 cards in this matchup. You're going to be able to kill one of those cheap creatures that the rogue decks will deploy early, Ruin, Crab, Soaring Thought Thief, etc. And then on the following turn, in Chapter 2, you get to nab a very important, a very crucial counterspell or a card like Into the Story.
Nice opener here from Grzegorz. He's got ways to interact. He's got ways to reload. And wow, another Elspeth's Nightmare here too. This is the technology that this particular team brought. They've got a few other things going on as well with this list. You know, our own expert commentator, Monty Devuti, was a part of the development of this deck. So we've got kind of the inside track on that, and I'm sure he's proud to see the deck that he designed doing well here, making it into the top 8. And as you can see, that Elspeth's Nightmare taking care of a rogue, but right back in business here for Huschenbeth. He goes Lurrus into Thieves Guild Enforcer, so the pressure will not be stopping here on Grzegorz Kowalski.
Yeah, and this is tough. I mean, I think you might just want to take Drown in the Lock. You could also, if you plan on the game going longer, you could just take the Into the Story. However, Arne doesn't have a second blue source currently, so maybe he can think he could nab it on the following turn with the Elspeth's Nightmare. One other thing to point out is both of the creatures on the battlefield have 3 power. So the other copy of Elspeth's Nightmare that Kowalski has in hand he can only really deploy it this turn as basically a duress effect on the following turn. So you might even see him look to run out of Behold the Multiverse here instead to try to find an answer for Lurrus. But this setup also makes sense. He's going to run out the Elspeth's Nightmare, hope that Arne doesn't draw a blue source for Into the Story, so that on the following turn, he's setting up for a Shadow's Verdict. If he can resolve a clean Shadow's Verdict and Arne doesn't draw a blue source, Arne really just won't have a lot of plays on this next turn.
Arne looks like he's content to keep on the maximum pressure here, goes for the Soaring Thought Thief. This has been a heck of a draw from both players, it must be said. You know, Grzegorz has been able to go blow for blow here, but Arne Huschenbeth has been able to rebuild his board quite effectively. And now you can see Lurrus and the Thieves Guild Enforcer enter combat. That's going to get more triggers from the Soaring Thought Thief. Generally speaking, the mill plan isn't super great here from Arne's side as Grzegorz is on a Yorion deck, but it still can happen.
Yeah, and what's really, really nice about this, the fact that Arne ran out the Soaring Thought Thief here means he doesn't have counter magic available. So now you can just take Into the Story because that's the card that allows Arne to claw back into this game in terms of resources. So, and just play around Disdainful Stroke at a later point of the match. So now you take the Into the Story, resolve the Shadow's Verdict, and all of a sudden, Arne's got nothing.
Wow, problem solved. Beautiful sequence here for Grzegorz Kowalski. And look at Arne Huschenbeth. He says anything but that. You just took away my way to reload, and now you've wiped my board on a clean 3-for-1 for Kowalski. Now it's really just about the top of the library here for Huschenbeth because he's got 2 defensive cards and no game plan to go forward. Now, one card that stands out to me here, Paul, though, is Castle Locthwain. His life total's under currently no pressure at all from Kowalski, and that means that Huschenbeth can take a few turns to draw some extra cards and try to find either more threats or an Into the Story or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. With the Locthwain, he can just continue to draw cards. You will probably see him draw 2, 3, 4 cards off that Castle Lockthwain fairly comfortably, because Kowalski's deck really doesn't put a whole lot of pressure until it resolves that key 7-mana sorcery in Emergent Ultimatum.
Good hand here for Kowalski in the sense that he's got card draw plus a powerful spell in Alrund's Epiphany. So he is setting himself up for a very powerful sequence here coming up to push himself into the late game now that he's got his mana underneath him. But this is going to give Huschenbeth a little bit of time here to try to find some pressure. And let's see if he hits here off of this castle activation.
Yeah, so he's scryed a Drown in the Loch to the top. So he's at least good for the... Ooh. He's good for the next 2 spells that Kowalski could play. And this didn't say please mean he's actually good for the next 3. So right now, Arne is really just looking for some kind of threat to put pressure on Kowalski. Kowalski's already down to 10 life here.
Binding of the Old Gods off the top of the library here for Grzegorz. He has the Alrund's Epiphany, which has been foretold, as well as Behold the Multiverse at the ready. And it looks like he's going to pay for Yorion. You know, he has to figure that Arne has counterspells in hand, right? Since he hasn't played anything over the last turn cycle, and what else could he have? Lands or some type of reactive spells. He does know about the Eliminate as well.
Yeah. The problem here, if you're on Kowalski's side, though, is you do need to just start playing out spells, because otherwise you're going to get crushed by the card advantage provided by this castle. So you're probably going to start seeing Kowalski just start casting spells and hope to basically run Arne out of counter magic. You're going to see this Behold the Multiverse here, and then next turn you're likely going to see Kowalski go for either the Alrund's Epiphany or the Yorion.
Arne taking a look at the scene here. Behold the Multiverse on the stack now for Kowalski.
Yeah, a lot to consider here. One of the biggest fears here is that Kowalski sets this up and then goes Sultai Ultimatum with Mystical Dispute backup, potentially. So Arne really just wants to make sure that he has the counters up for the impactful spells that Kowalski can play.
All right, so he's going to let it go. Another copy of Binding the Old Gods, as well as a Pathway and a Cultivate. So again, more kind of development reactive stuff here for Kowalski, but no way to really slam the door on this game. You know, there's no Emergent Ultimatum in sight currently. And even if there were, well, Arne has that base covered quite nicely. So, yeah, Arne just needs to keep on digging. It does start to get interesting now, right? Yeah, he's not under that much pressure life total-wise, but can you actually afford to start activating Castle Lockthwain when you've got 5 cards in your hand?
Yeah, which is why there might even be more incentive here for Arne to go with a counterspell here, probably a Disdainful Stroke, because you can go Stroke into draw more cards here.
Wow, he actually let the Yorion go. But that could limit the number of times he activates the castle now. Kind of an interesting trade-off, but he must figure, well, I can deal with that card. I'm looking at it, and I mean, he doesn't have an answer for it right now outside of the Drown in the Loch, and you'd assume he'd prefer to save that for something else.
Right. The thing is, the cards he really cares about, for the most part, you can hit with Disdainful Stroke as well in this matchup. So maybe he's just waiting to see exactly what Kowalski does and potentially fire off the Drown in the Loch just to kill the Yorion here. It is a bit painful. Arne would much rather try to find a Heartless Act to kill this Yorion.
Right, because he doesn't have that many targets for that anyway, where Drown in the Loch can be a hard counter, you know, basically at any point going forward now. But as you mentioned, it might have been the reverse of what I was thinking, in that he says, well, I actually have an answer for that that's not a counterspell, strictly speaking, and I may just need to use that. Interesting also, the Zagoth Triome in hand is set to get cycled here for Arne.
Yeah,
and he's going to go for Drown.
I think there could have also been some consideration to just running out the Triome, give yourself access to a little bit more blue mana, and also play an extra permanent onto the battlefield so that you can actually use the Castle Lockthwain.
Ooh, bingo, baby. There's an end of the story, into the hand now for Arne. He still needs to leave the shields up, as he is crimped on blue mana, as you just mentioned, Paul, and that is an issue for him. And so far, Arne's been fine with Grzegorz playing cards like Omen of the Sea and even Behold the Multiverse. He's like, sure. A third Binding the Old Gods, definitely not on the menu here for Kowalski, but Valky? Let's see. Does he have his Ketria Triome? Doesn't look like it. Valky just as a straight up spell's not great. Interestingly, a binding can search it up if he has a Ketria Triome in his list.
Yeah, I can't imagine he wants a third binding here.
It's in his graveyard.
The
Did you see that? I don't know if you caught
man.
that, but Grzegorz just looked through his whole yard for that Ketria Triome, saw it as the very bottom card, gave a little grimace and said, well, I guess I'm going to bottom this Valky.
Yeah, and that is one important thing when you're playing against this Rogues deck. When you have cards like Fabled Passage and your opponent has a mill trigger on the stack, you might want to go ahead and fetch that basic, because sometimes there is a chance that they just get the basic that you need.
Yeah, so the Triome's the only red source in the deck, and it's going to be left in the graveyard here for Kowalski. Now, there is an interesting wrinkle here, right, that if you do resolve an Emergent Ultimatum, you can still go grab Valky and you can still cast it as Tybalt. So that's not completely dead here to Kowalski, but for now, it's not going to be the game plan. So he put it on the bottom, but now, there we go. He sacrificed the Omen of the Sea, and he actually found an Emergent Ultimatum. So now it looks like what we're going to see here is a chain of Alrund's Epiphanies that Arne is going to be compelled to at least consider countering. And if so, Grzegorz is going to build up a board and take a bunch of extra turns. And if not, he may be able to churn through these counter spells and eventually clear the way for the Emergent Ultimatum.
And look at this.
Wow, Iron Discipline here from Arne Huschenbeth. He is just not going to flinch on these. He knows what he needs to counter.
Yeah, he knows that there is a very, very low chance that he's going to die to these bird tokens. So just wants to make sure that he has the counter spells available for the Emergent Ultimatum. Now, you might see him counter this one, because 4 birds could be a problem.
That's right. He probably feels comfortable burning these eliminates on birds, but this is going to get out of hand. He actually can't keep up with this, so that is going to earn a disdainful stroke. Grzegorz with the ability to cycle the Zagoth Triumph here if he just passes the turn, which is what he's going to do. And I think we're going to just see eliminate to take out both birds. Yeah. Arne's life total is down to 9. And he doesn't have a lot of targets for eliminate anyway, so away they go.
Yeah, but Arne firmly in the driver's seat here. Now he has access to 4 blue mana. He can go into the story with Didn't Say Please backup. He's got the Drown in the Lock. Kowalski needs to find some really strong draws here, because he only really has 1 threat in his hand.
Kind of an interesting interaction here as well, as those eliminates were effectively stuck in hand for Arne. And that could preclude him from activating Castle Lochthwain if he wants to, down the line. Now it feels like Into the Story is a primary plan, so he can just get that big card draw spell to reload and get a threat, right? The thing that we've noticed here is that Arne was able to apply huge pressure early in the game, even through a bunch of removal, but finally Kowalski was able to fully stabilize the board. And since then, we haven't seen a threat in sight for Huschenbeth. The good news for him is that his deck can transition to this kind of draw, go, counter your stuff, draw a bunch of cards, and then eventually he'll find those threats.
Oh, no lands to get with Fabled Passage here for Kowalski.
Oh, Maggox, that stinks.
So that means he can't set up a scenario where, he, at least on his side, he thinks he could bait a counter with the Seeker's Chariot into Emergent Ultimatum. Now he's 1 mana short from even trying to go for that.
You know, the mill plan is awkward for the opponent. Like we saw, the Ketria Triumph gone. You know, I don't know how big important that was, but it certainly was a consideration for Kowalski. And now we see that the combination of basics on the battlefield. Ooh, how about Polukranos Unchained, though, getting milled? You know, awkward goes both directions here, as it turns out.
Jeez. Oh, and the big problem with Polukranos is neither of Arne's removal spells in Heartless Act or Eliminate are very effective against the Polukranos. So if Arne wants to get that Polukranos off the battlefield, he's going to have to use a Drown in the Lock. But if he uses the Drown in the Lock to get the Polukranos, all of a sudden, I mean, Kowalski, the coast is clear to resolve this Emergent Ultimatum he has in hand.
Look at all those lands in hand here for Arne. Really rough. He does have a Zagoth Triumph that he could Desperation cycle, but this is getting worse. This one of Polukranos Unchained in the deck is going to wreak havoc, because if it ends up back in the graveyard again, it's just going to eat up more graveyard and potentially mess with Arne's game plan as well.
Jeez. I mean, that sequence there into the story, into Mil Polukranos, into drawing, basically whiffing off of your into the story. And now, I mean, he has to find an answer. He almost has to use this Drown in the Loch on the Polukranos.
Just a cold 12-12 here, ready to threaten Arne's life total,
goodness.
demand answers, and mess even with Gregor's own graveyard. And Arne, you can see the look on his face. He knows
This does not
that this
feel good.
Polukranos is going to spell doom for him. I do not see a way around this for him, as it's just a recursive lethal threat that Gregor's can just happily put on the stack as many times as Arne will let him.
Yeah, so a couple of choices. The thing is, Kowalski doesn't know, of course, that Arne completely whiffed, right, from this into the story. So for him, he could just continue to just escape Polukranos here.
Yeah.
And just run Arne out of counterspells, which will give Arne actually a turn to maybe chain something together here, right? Because if Kowalski just went for the ultimatum here and it resolved, it probably would be game over. But now, Arne's got a little bit of time, right? He can cycle, and he can also draw a card here off the Castle Locthwain.
There's the Soaring Thought Thief. That's the threat that he's been looking for such a long time, but it really does feel like it may be too little too late here against Polukranos Unchained. Particularly because of this, Kowalski has the mana up to do a little fight.
You can play another one just to remove a counter, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Might as well, as we say in the business. There's another Soaring Thought Thief. Wow.
Oh, this
Boy,
is
this
rough.
Polukranos Unchained is doing absolute overtime in this matchup. You know, you are playing with fire a bit when you play Dimir Rogues because of escape as a mechanic. You and I, Paul, were talking about, you were testing the matchup against Mono Red, and you were saying how difficult it got because there was a bunch of escape cards milled by you for your opponent that they could just simply cast out of the yard.
Yeah, I mean, Rogues is a deck where if you want to beat it, you can, right? You just as long as you can put enough escape cards into your graveyard, it's just so hard because you're just down a card every time they use that mechanic against you. So I know you can have cards like Cling to Dust to try to keep up, but yeah, ultimately it's still kind of tough. And Kowalski plays exactly one copy of Polukranos, but I mean, Arne did mill a ton of cards here, and it just the way that Polukranos lines up with the removal spells here just makes it so difficult. He can remove 3 counters.
Yeah.
But that's basically it.
Wow. Seriously, this Polukranos is an absolute nightmare, particularly at this stage of the game. Yeah, so the 3 counters come off, which actually does make it a non-lethal attack.
So Kowalski has the mana here.
Can he binding?
He's just got to go for
Doesn't
the ultimatum.
even need to, yeah.
It's got to be the biggest sign of weakness when your opponent goes main phase Heartless Act to remove 3 counters from your Polukranos.
Absolutely. Arne Huschenbeth is just shaking his head. He can't believe how this game has gone.
Oh, he's not going to do it. He's going to go for binding here, potentially double binding here, it looks like, which will give Arne 1 additional turn here.
Yeah, it's just hard to imagine what Arne could find, right?
It starts with Into the Story,
okay.
Right? Because that gives him multiple answers, right? If you can go into the story, into a Drown in the Loch plus counterspell for the Emergent Ultimatum or Key or Best the Sea God, there's always that chance. Because Kowalski took the more conservative line here of going for the double binding to get the Thought Thief off the battlefield, Arne does have a slight chance here.
Technically another turn.
Yeah, and again, it starts with Into the Story off the top.
Some people in chat were wondering about the library size for Kowalski. I don't know the exact number, but remember, this is a Yorion deck. This deck starts with 80 cards, and through the normal course of play from Rogues, it almost never gets milled out. It's extremely rare to have the mill plan happen on a game like this, where, yeah, there were some Rogues attacked. You know, there's a full graveyard. It usually doesn't get to the point of actually getting it. It needs one of those absurd draws, or maybe out of the sideboard or whatever, a Rune Crab or something like that to really do it. So
Yeah,
that's not going to be on the table here.
you need crab draws or a game that gets extended to the point where you get off a big Agadeem's Awakening and get back all the rogues that you have and your crabs in the graveyard to start multi-chaining here. So, okay, that's not quite into the story, but get you 2 cards.
It's halfway.
Okay.
He's just sort of churning through here. He's okay. Wind Robber into of one mine into Wind Robber.
Just spinning his wheels here. Now the thing is, if he finds an into the story, right, he has to use a removal spell to kill Polukranos, which means the Emergent Ultimatum will resolve. So I don't think Arne really has too many outs here anymore.
I think we're just done. I mean, the fact that it used up a bunch of his mana just to even get to this point. We'll also remember that the Wind Robber isn't going to be able to actually block the Polukranos because Polukranos can just fight it. Binding triggers ×2, but this is all just icing on the cake as you see actually a really stacked rest of the library here for Kowalski. He has some of his most powerful 7-mana spells still kind of stuck in there.
You just go for it here.
But yeah, you're just going to windmill it because there's only so much that Huschenbeth can do with the amount of mana that he has left.
Yeah, if he has a counterspell here, then you just fight the Wind Robber and just win.
And it's GG, yeah.
So
yeah, Huschenbeth cannot activate the castle on 1 life. There's just nothing
so now
to do.
You just get Vorinclex Epiphany plus anything, and either you take an extra turn and you win the game, or you just have a big haste creature and you win the game.
Yeah. This is Kowalski putting the finishing touches on a near sure victory. Honestly, once Polukranos showed up, it was extraordinarily difficult for Huschenbeth. I mean, the thing to remember here is the stage of the game that we were at when that happened, right? It's not only the recursive threat, because you could imagine a world, right, where Kowalski goes, okay, I'll tap all my mana, play Polukranos, and Huschenbeth says, okay, counter it, hit you with 2 Soaring Thought Thieves, right? And then the next time that happens again, and he goes, okay, drown in the locket, hit you with the Soaring Thought Thieves. And you're, okay, maybe there's a plan here, but that's not where we're at. We had already had Cultivate resolved for Kowalski, as well as just many, many turns having gone by. So he was able to put Polukranos on the battlefield and also fight that turn. And that is just unstoppable. I could not see a way for Huschenbeth realistically, given the state of affairs there. He needed to have Kowalski at like 3 life or almost no cards in the library to be able to make anything work. And boy, if I'm Kowalski, I'm just framing that Polukranos Unchained. He brought in another one as well.
It was looking so good for Arne. Arne had fought back through that devastating Shadow's Verdict with the Castle Locked-In, and he was able to draw a bunch of cards, and your hand is just stacked with counterspells. But milling, I don't know if it was the last card or the second to last card, but that didn't say please into Polukranos. I mean, that was the turning moment of that match, because prior to that, it looked like Arne was firmly in the driver's seat there.
Wow. What a turnaround. Kowalski, it was kind of funny watching it from Kowalski's perspective as well, because he had a tough game, right? Like he managed to stabilize that board, but then the cards in his hand weren't super relevant. In fact, they were not relevant enough even for Huschenbeth to counter them. And he was trying to eventually maneuver himself into a position where he could, do 2 things, cast an Emergent Ultimatum, but it really felt like it was going to be one of those slogs that he needed to just start throwing spells at Huschenbeth. And if Huschenbeth drew, like, for example, another end of this story, that he may be able to just outcard him and have too many answers for the amount of relevant spells from Kowalski. And then Polukranos went in the yard and was like, oh, never mind. Yeah. All that jockeying for position, all that game planning, all that worry just disappeared.
And as you can see, Huschenbeth actually boarding out the Ruin Crabs here. The thing is, these games tend to go a little bit longer. And so eventually you're going to get your opponent 7 to 8 cards in their graveyard. And also you're not really looking to turbo mill up your opponents anyway. So he wants to just have more proactive threats. And as you can see, he's boarding in 3 copies of Skyclave Shade that Kowalski will have some difficulty dealing with in this matchup. And actually, as a nod to the fact that Skyclave Shade exists, you saw that Kowalski chose to keep in the 2 copies of Asika's Chariot that he has in the main, which typically you would expect people to you would expect that card to not be so great, and it isn't. It isn't very good game one because all the creatures fly. However, after sideboard, you have to respect the shade.
Really impressive. You know, this is also represents a game plan shift here for Kowalski, who has taken out all of the emergent ultimatums from his list. He understands that this matchup does not favor that type of game plan. And we honestly got to see that where Huschenbeth really had the ultimatums covered there in game number one. Again, it was just a Polukranos that sort of threw a wrench in the works. But now he can play a much different game plan. And bringing in Esika's Chariot is really shows, you know, where Kowalski's at here. He knows exactly what's up for the matchup.
Yeah, and I like this decision to take Disdainful Stroke without the mill cards that Arne has. Arne doesn't have a Soaring Thought Thief or a Wind Robber or a Crab or anything like that. So that Drown in the Lock, not doing anything right now. So it's really important for Kowalski to try to resolve that Extinction event that he has in his hand. So he'd rather take that Disdainful Stroke, which is going to be a hard counter, for that removal spell.
Jwari Disruption.
Yeah, Kowalski choosing to play 2 copies of Jwari Disruption, and 2 copies of Pelaka Predation as a nod to the fact that coming into this tournament, you were going to expect a lot of Sultai Ultimatum, and having those spell lands gives you a very big edge, just because of their versatility.
Yeah, you know, we were talking to Monty about that. That was an innovation that Monty brought to this build of the deck. And, you know, we were saying, but what about the fixing? Because you lose temples, right? Those replace like Temple of Deceit you see here from Huschenbeth's side. These temples that are powerful in the scry, right? I mean, they just matter. They just do, especially when you're playing an 80 card deck. And they also act as mana fixing. But Monty said, you know what? You can get away with it. Our mana is actually fine, and you get that added spell land bonus that you just mentioned, Paul. And then they felt like it gave them a nice little edge in the mirror.
Yep, and it's worked out for Kowalski.
Also, it does show that the preparation that team had with regards to the predicted metagame was also on point. Ooh, there's Polukranos. One of the two. He's got 2 now. And that it did end up being the most popular deck as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a lot of interesting choices that Kowalski can go with here. He knows that there's probably a decent chance any of his spells are going to resolve here, right? Because he did fire off that duress. So, playing something like a Binding the Old Gods is awkward because you know that there's a high chance that Arne can play it again next turn, but it does allow you to get a land next turn. The Extinction event does mean that you can just permanently get that Skyclave Shade off the battlefield. Fortunately for Arne, found a Soaring Thought Thief, so he still has a relevant play this turn to follow that up, and most importantly, will also put additional cards in Kowalski's graveyard. I believe this is going to put 4 cards into his graveyard, meaning this Drown in the Lock will now be able to counter any of Kowalski's spells next turn.
Okay. So Arne is going to be a little bummed to see the Shade get exiled, but as you mentioned, the Soaring Thought Thief doing its thing, building up that graveyard, enabling Drown in the Lock, and eventually enabling itself.
And Arne deep in the tank here. Do I want to just run out this Lurrus here, or do I really need to counter something?
He's probably thinking, if I run out Lurrus and Grzegorz has a card like Binding the Old Gods or Elspeth's Nightmare, which, by the way, he has both, how bad is it for me?
Yeah. Elspeth's Nightmare isn't so bad, right? Because it can't kill the Lurrus. If you kill the Thought Thief, you can get it back. If Kowalski has Binding the Old Gods, that's a lot rougher because then you use the Binding the Old Gods to kill the Lurrus.
As it turns out, Grzegor's hand is just stacked here. I mean, look at that hand. He's got all of it. He even has Eliminate in there, as well as the hero of the day from Kowalski's perspective, Polukranos Unchained, another binding off the top. No land drop for him just yet.
Yeah, this is interesting. Kowalski has a couple of options here. He can go with Binding, or he can go with Eliminate on Lurrus with Negate backup to play around Mystical Dispute. But I suppose playing Binding the Old Gods allows you to play around Dispute anyways. Right. So this just makes sense because, he's going to miss a land drop this turn. Binding the Old Gods is going to be a clean 2-for-1 here.
And, there's also an additional incentive. Oh, God. Polukranos into the graveyard here off of the mill trigger from Soaring Thought Thief. It's like a nightmare for Huschenbeth. There's a Skyclave Shade. Look at that Coma Cosmos Serpent, too.
Yeah, Kowalski just needs mana, right?
That's right. And I think that was part of the incentive to play the Binding last turn, Paul.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. And now this turn, Kowalski has another tough decision to make. Looks like he's just going to go for the instance here with eliminate plus negate. And if you're going to do that, it makes sense to do it on your opponent's turn to tax their mana.
Paul, are you looking at the hand here for Kowalski? Is that not just a work of art? Look at that. The Coma, Binding, Polukranos, else. It's like all 2-for-1s and bombs. And this is like my dream, honestly. I'm a Sultai player through and through, and this is where I want to be in life. That hand is, I would screenshot that and send it to you and Luis. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, Kowalski's deck basically transforms into just a pure Sultai control deck for this matchup after sideboard. You can't really afford to just play a bunch of 7-mana sorceries and hope that they'll resolve. So you actually try to slim down your deck, have a bunch of removal, and if you're gonna play something expensive, make sure it's something like a Polukranos or a Coma, which can't be countered.
Man, our documentation says that Grzegorz is from Poland, but currently he's living in Value Town. Population 1, and it is Grzegorz Kowalski. He has a absolutely stacked hand. Now his life total is down to 9, and he hasn't hit a land drop this turn. So we still got a game here.
Yeah, I'm actually liking Arne's position here, to be honest. I mean, Grzegor's hand has a handful of awesome cards, but the fact that he's missed a couple of land drops here means, I mean, he can only really play one spell out a turn, right? And Grzegorz is already down to 9. We have a Thieves Guild Enforcer that's going to be a 3/2, and Arne has a counterspell backup here to go with that as well. So, for example, I mean, if Grzegorz chooses to keep... Okay, interesting. I thought he might have considered going with the untapped land so that he could try to run out of Binding the Old Gods here to stay alive, but this does allow him to resolve Coma next turn, which is something that he might be going for. However, if Arne keeps his mana up, I mean, you just kill Coma before the next turn, and you don't even get a 3/3 token.
Grzegorz Kowalski looking to stay alive just long enough to capitalize on all of the raw power in his hand, and frankly, his graveyard with the Polukranos Unchained. If he can get that thing escaped onto the battlefield, that will turn off a lot of what's going on in Huschenbeth's side. An untap, what's that?
Well, Arne, this is a really big decision here from Arne, but he needs to play the 3/2 here. Sorry, it's just...
Oh, no problem.
Yeah. It was a big decision. It's really great to want to play out an Into the Story there, but by doing this, it forces Kowalski to have a removal spell. If you don't, you go down to 3, and you need to answer both of these creatures that are in play.
Yeah, that's going to be very difficult here for Kowalski. Particularly with Drown in the Loch at the ready for Huschenbeth.
Shark Typhoon is not bad.
Oh, Shark Typhoon's interesting.
But I think this is just game here. I think this is just game because, again, Kowalski needs to deal with 2 threats here. And Arne has Heartless Act for a creature. If you're going to make a shark token or whatever, you have the answer there. You can also use that to kill Coma. And then you have Drown in the Loch for the second removal spell if Kowalski goes for that.
It looks like Arne Huschenbeth has found a way to lock out Grzegorz Kowalski here as he looks... Oh, there's the Sika's Chariot. Does that do it?
Wow. Yeah, that was... So now Arne can go for Drown in the... No, I don't think it will. So Arne can go for a counterspell here.
It gets negated.
On the Chariot, it gets negated. You Heartless Act one of the tokens, and then that's
right.
lethal.
And then that's lethal, because if he does it on Grzegor's turn, Grzegorz can't even respond. So, yeah, there you go. Arne Huschenbeth shows patience, and boy, he is going to be happy to escape with the win here, because if this thing would have gone a turn longer, That's not, look at that hand. I mean, both Polukranos showed up, the Elspeth's Nightmare, but you know, you got to give credit to Arne here, who showed patience. And also, look, that Elspeth's Nightmare would have been amazing normally, but the Skyclave Shade out of the board, the pumped up Thieves Guild Enforcer, means that he was able to dodge it and earn the victory here as he crashes in for 3 damage. And whew, we're going to get a game 3 between these two players.
Yeah, and well played there by Arne, recognizing just all the different cards that Kowalski could play at every single turn, and trying his best to kind of play around that. And yeah, I mean, this is what makes this matchup just so tricky if you're on the side of the Sultai deck, just because, I mean, sure, you can trim down some of your deck, but not all the way, right? All of your spells just cost 4, 5, 6 mana, and you're playing against a deck that's just full of 1 and 2 mana threats with a bunch of cheap, efficient removal. And this is why this Rogues deck is, you know, one of Sultai's worst matchups, right? And Kowalski's list is actually better than others that we've seen because he has access to cards like Elspeth's Nightmare. But even then, you know, just the way that the cards line up against each other, it just makes it very difficult for the Sultai deck.
Back to the drawing board here for Kowalski. You know, he ended up, the land situation really caught up to Grzegorz that game. He ended up playing Binding the Old Gods, which did get him a land tapped onto the battlefield, but boy, did he need an untapped land that one turn. Didn't find it, and ended up losing the game on a narrow loss there with time. And that does happen sometimes for these decks. You know, they do play very expensive spells, and even though he's removed his Emergent Ultimatums, you know, there's still, you know, Coma costs 7 mana. I mean, these things still cost a lot to put on the stack.
Yeah, one actually very key draw in the early phases of that game was the draw of the Soaring Thought Thief from Arne Huschenbeth, because Kowalski tapped out turn 4 for that Extinction event, and Arne was able to follow that up with a threat that continued to fill up Kowalski's graveyard that basically unlocked the rest of his hand there too, allowing his Drown in the Loch to actually do anything, because early on he just didn't have any way to fill up Kowalski's graveyard.
Also, am I seeing this right, Paul? According to this, that's 14 cards coming in, which isn't that his whole sideboard?
For Kowalski?
Yeah. Like, because he's got Yorion. Like, is that just all of the cards?
Is Karavik coming in too?
Our graphic said so.
Nice. That is interesting. I suppose it gets the Wind Robbers, and if you don't have 8 cards in your graveyard, it gets the Thieves Guild Enforcer. But yeah.
Wow, that's just aggressive.
Talk about a transformational sideboard.
All right, game number 3 underway here. If you're just joining us, welcome, welcome. We're in the upper semifinal number 1 between Arne Huschenbeth and Grzegorz Kowalski. And this has been a sweet match to kick off the day, at least for Paul and I. We had some really good ones with Alien Monty as well.
Oh.
And here we go, Cultivate. What are you seeing, Paul?
Well, I see a Shadow's Verdict here in Kowalski's hand, and I see
Yikes.
2 copies of Skyclave Shade. If Arne goes for a second Skyclave Shade here with Mystical Dispute backup, well, that's not going to be good here for Arne.
Now, can he afford not to? Does he have viable alternate options?
He does. He can just play the land here tapped and then just go for a Soaring Thought Thief.
Okay, he's decided to play it untapped to give him access to hardcast Mystical Dispute.
Right. Life total doesn't matter.
Right. Going to pass it back over here to Kowalski. So he will not get that clean Shadow's Verdict 2-for-1, particularly clean on 2 Skyclave Shade, which can keep coming back over and over.
Yeah, and I
so
think
he's going to have to take some damage, it looks like.
Yeah, and I think because of that, Kowalski is going to just look to develop his mana here, and potentially go for Shadow's Verdict plus maybe a Jwari Deception backup here. Also, playing the untapped land does allow you to play around Jwari Disruption if you're going to run out this Soaring Thought Thief.
That's right. That's really important here too, because that would have certainly snapped that off. So even the smallest decisions adding up here for Huschenbeth, playing the Agadim untapped there matters a lot in this scenario. And in comes the two threats, the Skyclave Shade, Soaring Thought Thief. Down to 13 goes Grzegorz Kowalski. Temple of Deceit now from Huschenbeth. He's going to make a decision on his scry. But eventually, Grzegorz is going to have to do something.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's got... Oh,
can he just set
nice.
up? That was nice too, but he also... He can go Shadow's Verdict plus Jwari Disruption, right?
He can, but
Yeah.
but of course, it feels much better knowing that you have Mystical Dispute up here instead, if Arne had something like a Disdainful Stroke.
Right. It looks like it is going to be the Dispute hard cast here, and that will open the door now for Kowalski to disrupt if he chooses to do so. Hey, getting that sweet, sweet disruption value feels really nice. Not quite as nice as a 2-for-1, though, from Shadow's Verdict. That was really good for Kowalski. And now a similar position that we've seen Huschenbeth in before is he needs to rebuild his board.
Yeah, and he's going to run out this Shade here. And because Kowalski just has so much mana in play, he could potentially start looking to play around Mystical Dispute at the very least here from Arne.
Nice draw there. He's got Binding the Old Gods. He also had Artless Act in his hand, did Kowalski. So this Skyclave Shade should be able to be kept at bay at least for a bit. Yorion tax gets paid. Land hits the battlefield, and he's going to pass the turn back over so that he can use the Heartless Act.
Ooh.
Soaring Thought Thief. There's another threat for Huschenbeth.
Yeah, that was big.
He's just going to take the 3 here. And does Kowalski just do nothing with the turn? Because Huschenbeth just said, your move.
Yeah, I mean, playing it a little bit patient, probably just going to go for a Binding here.
This is definitely the higher upside of the plays. He has 4 mana available, so he can pay for a Mystical Dispute. He can also dispute back in that scenario.
But Arne has a Fabled Passage in play.
That's right.
So he can just kind of let this happen, run out of Soaring Thought Thief, and the next turn just play it again as a 3-1 with Drown in the Loch plus Mystical Dispute backup.
Okay.
But if you're Kowalski here, you're really going to want to Heartless Act this Soaring Thief most likely.
Yeah, for sure. So here it is, Heartless Act on Soaring Thought Thief.
I'm curious how many cards this puts into Kowalski's graveyard. The key number here being 7 for Into the Story. Now, Arne can choose to fight back here with a hard cast Mystical Dispute.
That does have Drown in the Loch.
Yeah, he could also go with Drown in the Loch. Kowalski has 8 mana in play. So Mystical Dispute would effectively counter an Emergent Ultimatum. Now, we know that Kowalski boarded all 4 copies out, but Arne does not. So he's still going to be mindful of the fact that some copies of that card can still be in Kowalski's deck.
Okay, he's going to let it go. Heartless Act takes care of Soaring Thought Thief, and it looks like Arne's plan is to pay Lurrus tax here.
Yeah, this is a big turn. I mean, Kowalski's hand doesn't have a whole lot. Arne doesn't know that, of course. But he knows that it's very likely that Kowalski is going to want to cast Yorion next turn. He's going to be able to get a land, and he wants to be able to blink that Binding. And I imagine Arne is going to go for the counter here. Now, he cannot Mystical Dispute, but he can just go with Drown in the Loch. And then when Kowalski goes for his Mystical Dispute, he can dispute back. Okay. And that's what I imagine is going to happen here. Yeah,
this does favor Arne, depending on how Arne wants to approach it, but it feels like letting Yorion resolve just isn't an option.
Yeah, I mean, you have Kowalski down. Yeah, you have Kowalski down to 10. You kind of want to whittle down his life total. But we've seen Arne choose to be very patient here. Wow, okay.
Interesting. He's going to fire off Mystical Dispute against Kowalski, who has 3 mana available.
Yeah, so he's going to go for double dispute here, and he really, really is valuing the fact that he has that Drown in the Loch as a hard counter. And that's what he wants to save that for whatever future play that Kowalski could have. So instead, he knows at this point, Kowalski's a good player. he's going to try his best to play around Mystical Dispute if he can, right? If he can afford to, he's going to do that. So the value of these Mystical Disputes in my hand are not very high. So I want to just use these and get some value out of it where I can.
So he's fine just ripping up 2 of these to counter the Ori and figuring this is one of the best case scenarios I can get at this point.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, this also means that he's going to be able to safely untap and resolve into the story, right? So even if you're down 2 cards here, you're going to be able to safely fill back up. And if you draw a land, you'll have Drown in the Lock for whatever Kowalski could play next turn.
Really smart by Huschenbeth, recognizing that the value of his cards change over time here and knowing that into the story. And look at that big head shake from Kowalski. He says, no, anything but that one, because he knows that that's the type of game-breaking card, particularly when he's sitting there holding Mystical Dispute against Arne, who doesn't even have his 7th land yet.
Yeah, and this would have been an excellent spot for Kowalski to have an Emergent Ultimatum, right? Because he's got the Mystical Dispute back up here, but
yeah,
doesn't
but
have a card like that to top deck.
No, he's going to play Elspeth's Nightmare here, but it's just going to get ran out for its 2nd chapter, and then maybe the 3rd could be relevant. But for now, it's going to be a non-play. You just put it on the battlefield, and he's going to have to lean on the 2 removal spells he has back, and really the top of his library here.
Yeah, and keep in mind, he also has to fight through that Luris.
That's right. It is still in the companion zone, so it's a ways off from coming back. But yeah, next turn, Arne could just go, okay, pay the tax, and then all of a sudden it's threatening the turn after. He's going to use Heartless Act to take out the Thieves Guild Enforcer, leaving just Skyclave Shade. But Kowalski's life total getting precarious here. He is down to 7, and there's 3 damage that could come across this turn as well. And I think this is where, you say your prayers to the magic gods, because Kowalski needs a top deck here, something fierce.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, I mean, Arne is looking at 2 hard counters here in that Drown in the Lock and Didn't Say Please that Kowalski needs to fight through. Now, he can nab one of them with the Elspeth's Nightmare. And if Arne uses some of his mana on his turn, he could potentially position something to resolve with that Mystical Dispute backup that he has in hand.
And it looks like Arne is just going to try to overload his hand, basically, and say, okay, Elspeth's Nightmare is going to get something, but if I draw enough cards, it'll only take 1 something, and I might have enough to take care of business. There's some really nice top decks here for Kowalski, but, given a big library size, I mean, there's only the 1 Coma floating around. It's Palaka Predation off the top of the library here. And he is going to have a lot of information, given that Elspeth's Nightmare is going to go for its duress effect now, and Kowalski can try to formulate a game plan, but he's down to 4.
Yeah, so he can go for Drown in the Lock, and then Palaka Predation away the Didn't Say Please, and that would allow him to at least take the 2 counter spells out of Arne's hand. He has an Eliminate for the Skyclave Shade if he wants to protect his life total, but I mean, he still has a huge hill to climb here with what Arne is working with here.
He may need to get lucky and just rip the Coma here, Paul. We are starting to talk about him needing really the very, very top of his curve now. We're not in a situation where he can just sort of, find a decent card and kind of see what happens. Like, he is starting to get into desperation mode here, and this could be one of those scenarios where if he can rip, he can steal this game back. But if he doesn't, there's a whole bunch of cards in the library that don't do enough, and Arne could finish the job here.
Kowalski just debating whether or not he wants to fire off this Eliminate now before Arne potentially draws another counter spell.
It's technically not lethal, but he's down to 4.
He could also make a wolf, right? He could just make a wolf off the Wolf Willow Haven, and that would buy him a turn. Arne doesn't have a removal spell in hand. Might want to save that Eliminate for the Luris if it gets to that point. One interesting thing, though, is that at least on Kowalski's next turn, the Elspeth's Nightmare will exile Arne's graveyard. So that Agadeem's Awakening will be a little bit less problematic. If anything, what Kowalski wants to do is eliminate the Skyclave Shade end of turn, or get it to die end of turn, and then wait till, and then on his turn, Elspeth's Nightmare goes to chapter 3, and you get to cleanly exile the Skyclave Shade.
Yeah, that's a would be nice here for Kowalski. And he does need to pay attention to the smaller details at this point, because he's really going to need to get pretty lucky here off the top of the library in any case. But you certainly don't want to focus so much on that you forget that you need to do these other little things as well. There's Cling to Dust.
Oh,
for Huschenbeth. And he
geez.
finds Drown in the Lock with it.
Oh my.
And there's Soaring Thought Thief, so another threat, particularly if this Shade were to hit. And that is exactly what's going to happen. Now it starts to feel like there's really no chance here for Kowalski.
Yeah, I just don't see it here. I mean, he's got to fight through the he's got to fight through the Skyclave Shade, and also the Soaring Thought Thief with Drown in the Lock backup.
Yeah, and I assume we're going to see Eliminate on the Shade for that line that you mentioned, and he just has to hope that Arne didn't find another threat, but he did.
Yeah.
So I think we're just down to Coma here.
So the thing is, Kowalski. Well, that's it.
All that interesting discussion just went away, as did this match for Grzegorz Kowalski, as Arne Huschenbeth playing the patient game plan, but hitting really nicely here over this last sequence. This Wolf Willow Haven token is not going to do anything, and all he has to do is make sure that he can resolve Soaring Thought Thief, and he can attack for lethal, as he's got Kowalski down to just one. And there it is, Thought Thief on the stack, and there's only one play available here for Kowalski.
And this is getting countered back.
That's right, Drown in the Lock.
Kowalski's got one card left. What else are you saving this for? If he's got a counter back, then he's going to have no cards in hand, and then you can get back the Soaring Thought Thief next turn with your Lurrus or your Agadeem's Awakening. You know, the only way this turns out horribly is if somehow Kowalski has a counter and then top decks a Coma or something. So, I mean, it just seems like you got to go for it here.
Yeah, that's exactly what Arne decides. He says, well, I'm just going to go for it, and Soaring Thought Thief hits the battlefield. And that means that it gets to attack for lethal. There's a good game from Grzegorz Kowalski, and Arne Huschenbeth has won his opening semifinal here, continuing his winning ways with Dimir Rogues.